Thank you for tuning in to Docs and Boxed. Make sure you guys like this video and subscribe to our channel so that more people can get the content that you love. Enjoy!
Welcome to another episode of Docs and Box. Today we're here with Dr. Aric Prather. Could you just introduce yourself with your name and your job and just something cool about you?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Aric Prather. I'm a clinical health psychologist and a professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of California, San Francisco. I run a research program on sleep and how it affects our health, and I also run a clinical program focused on treating people with insomnia and other sleep disorders using behavioral strategies.
Mhm. So you mentioned all of these works you're doing on sleep, which is really cool. So I was wondering what made you interested, like what made you want to study sleep science?
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely probably not something that people just kind of think their whole life, like, oh, I wanna figure out this sleep stuff. No, yeah, I initially I really wanted to go into medicine,
Mhm.
and so I was pre-med in college and kind of did all the stuff that you need to do, like took the MCATs and all that kind of stuff, and then uh, I started I actually so I went to UC Berkeley and I started like doing some research in the psychology department there, and then got like a fellowship for like a summer intern thing at UCSF. And I started working with some folks that were doing really interesting work on depression and kind of the endocrine system, like kind of how when people are depressed, they have changes in their neuroendocrine function that might have relevance to kind of downstream health outcomes. And I like fell in love with doing research.
Mhm.
And I was like, man, like I was so excited. I'd like read paper after paper and, really wanted to dig into it. And at that point, I kind of abandoned going into medicine because I didn't want to spend the next some odd years just trying to get back to what I was already into. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? And so I was looking for like another avenue. And so I went into clinical psychology where you can do in mostly research, but still get trained clinically. And the lab that I went into, so I went to the University of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, and the lab that I started in was a lab that's focused on psychoneuroimmunology. And so this is this kind of like subfield where people are interested in kind of psychological and behavioral factors that impact the immune system.
Mhm.
And so we would do like a ton of work on stress. That was like our main thing. And so we'd like bring people into the laboratory and stress them out, and we'd be drawing their blood throughout the whole thing. And then I would take it from, I would do the stress part, and then I would go into the laboratory and at the bench side and start doing all the assays that to understand what's happening with, say, cell redistribution in the peripheral blood, or kind of changes in T cell functioning or what have you. And and while I was doing that, there was a collaborator that we had who her whole focus was sleep. Like she threw sleep into everything.
Mhm.
And I mean, the truth is, like, I needed a project for my dissertation. And so I was like, we had all this sleep data, and I was like, oh, like maybe I can get into this. And the whole time I was like, I'm not, no, I'll just do this and I won't become like a sleep researcher per se. But then, I came to find that like the very things that happen to the immune system under periods of acute or chronic amounts of stress are the same kind of things that happen when you sleep deprive a person, or
Mhm.
when someone has like a chronic sleep disorder. It really impairs the immune system. And so I was like, they're clearly sleep and stress are related to one another. We have some good tools to help
Mhm.
people sleep better. And so I just kind of followed that path. And then, it just turned out that like I was able to do some research that had high impact, that people, got a lot of attention. And I kind of just kept doing that. And then during that time, the way it works for a clinical psychologist is you have to do like it's kind of like a 1 year residency that you would do in medicine, but it's just clinical work. And so I did that at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. And there I had the opportunity to kind of do a rotation with one of the kind of pioneers in cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. So I
Mhm.
got trained in doing that, and it was like I was hooked. Like the when you can give someone their sleep back, like after they haven't been sleeping for in many cases like decades,
Yeah.
like it's like life changing for them, right?
Mhm.
Like everything feels better. Like their mood is better, their health is better, they're better partners, they're better parents. Like all of these things change. And so I was like, man, if I ever kind of can kind of mix research and clinical work, it's going to be in this space.
Mhm.
And so, and then ever since then, I've just been really lucky to be able to kind of continue doing that work.
Mhm. So what it seems like from what I gathered from what you said, like it seems like you found all these opportunities for yourself and that kind of pulled you towards sleep and like clinical psychology, right? But were there any other factors that kind of rather than like pull factors, I guess I would say push factors that like pushed you away from medicine? Like what made
Hmm.
you averse to that? And
I mean, I think so I think the thing that pushed me away, I mean, I guess it depends on how you frame it.
Mhm.
Like I really wanted the opportunity to do research right away.
Okay.
And the only, the first 2 years of medical school are, primarily classes. I did not love those classes. Like, like I mean, I like maybe the first semester of organic chemistry, I was like, wow, I got this. And then like everything after that, I was like, oh my God, like I'm just don't love it. But and I don't know. I think I was probably a little bit, concerned about just the amount of hours that you have to put in, and the road ahead. I mean, that being said, like I really was drawn towards kind of care, right?
Yeah.
Like being able to do stuff. And, I will say in my position now, I work with tons of physicians, um, and, we do lots of really important work within the health system to try to make it better for doctors, to try to make it better for patients. And so, there really is a place to kind of do all those things and not necessarily be on the front line of like, day-to-day care of patients, though of course that's really important. And I think the best I think if I was to like read to do it again, I
Mhm.
think the best possible model is like an MD PhD where
Mhm.
you can kind of do both of those sorts of things. Because I've like worked with some of the smartest, like most innovative people I've ever worked with have been MD PhDs, just because they both have the skill within kind of the physician training, but also kind of the the rigor that you would see with someone that goes through a PhD program.
Yeah. Could you like explain what an MD PhD is? Because I don't know.
Oh, sure. Sorry. I'm sorry. So,
Yeah.
there's like different types of so someone who gets an MD PhD, so the MD is the medical doctor
Mhm.
piece, right? Which I'm sure this podcast is more acquainted to, and then the PhD is kind of what I have, right? Which is like a doctor of philosophy, and so there are programs in which you can get both,
Okay.
right? So, I had a colleague when I was in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where he got his MD at the University of Pittsburgh and his PhD at Carnegie Mellon University, which is like right next to it.
Mhm.
There's lots of people. I mean, UCSF has a program like UCSF, UC Berkeley has a program where they do MD PhDs where, and usually I don't know if it's always this way, but oftentimes there's like some order to it. Like maybe you do, your MD classes and then you do your PhD and then you finish your MD class, your MD training and then you do residency, things like that. So, but I mean, it definitely often makes it longer, like the schooling longer,
Yeah.
right? But, I mean, I don't know. So, I mean, there's also, I think maybe the most common is in that vein is I've met a lot of MDs that have masters in public health too, so
Mhm.
MPHs, which I think there's probably lots of programs where you can kind of get that concurrently. But I mean, it usually pushes people that gravitate towards that often ends up being like physician scientists, where they both kind of treat patients, but they also have a research agenda or program that they're trying to push forward.
Yeah. So that's pretty cool. I actually didn't know about that. But yeah, moving on to more about sleep. So
Yeah.
start off with the basics. So what can you explain like what happens to the body and the brain when we fall asleep?
Yeah, so yeah, so I mean you sent along these topics and I was like, wow, like that's a big topic to go through because like tons of things happen, right? I mean, there's changes in the brain and kind of the uptick and downregulation of things like, catecholamines and serotonin, histamine.
Mm,
But then, there's like clear cardiovascular changes that happen, right? So people's blood pressure tends to dip while they're sleeping. There's an upregulation in this aspect of your autonomic nervous system called the parasympathetic nervous system. So kind of that rest and digest arm. So there's an upregulation in that. I mean, there's, muscle, like one of the things that happens while you sleep is there's kind of this restoration, right? So, there's cellular repair,
mm,
there's kind of the ridding of DNA damage, there's now this understanding that there is, an increase in cerebral spinal fluid that bathes the brain and helps clear things out of the brain, like metabolites that build up through the lymphatic system. I mean, there's just a whole host of things that happen. And then, in related to that, right? Like sleep is not just one thing. It's very much a dynamic process where we cycle every 90 minutes through aspects of sleep, both non-rapid eye movement sleep and rapid eye movement sleep or REM sleep, right? Where, we go from kind of the most awake state down to kind of N1, 2, and 3, with N3 being kind of the slow wave sleep, that restorative aspect of sleep, and then moving up into REM sleep, that dreaming sleep, and that kind of cycles throughout the night where, in the first half of the night, there's a disproportionate amount of this slow wave sleep, and then in the second half of the night, you get more of this REM sleep, but you go in and out, and you kind of come out of sleep a lot of times. I mean, people wake up a bunch of times in the laboratory and at homes in our lives, but we often don't recognize all of those things, but it's just part of this dynamic nature of what happens in the brain as we're sleeping.
mhm. So you're talking about these sleep cycles. So do we know why the body actually cycles through all of these different stages? And if not, then do we know why they're important?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't think we have a good understanding of why we cycle through the stages, other than we know that every aspect of sleep is important. I
Mhm.
mean, I think one of the things that's interesting is, we measure. So sleep science is, we've learned a lot, but there's still a lot unknown about it. And
Mhm.
and even if you think about how we measure sleep, right? So the most typical way is through something called polysomnography, where
Okay.
we use electrodes that we put on the scalp at different places around the head, and then kind of measure electrical activity, something called EEG.
Mhm.
And so we'll measure that, and then there are kind of characteristics in the EEG that tell us what we think are different stages of sleep, but we're still kind of just measuring electrical activity on the scalp where, like, there may be aspects deep in the brain that
Mhm.
are relevant, but we're not able to kind of tap that with this type
Yeah.
of this type of tool. And so, it that itself is a little bit kind of not as comprehensive as we might like. Now, there are newer methods that kind of take that electrical signal and break it down even further,
Mhm.
kind of using something called spectral analysis, where we're like starting to learn about potential different signatures within these electrical waves to help
Yeah.
maybe give us a little bit more granularity about what's going on with sleep. But all of the aspects of sleep seem to be important. I mean, so for instance, like N1 is kind of this light sleep. N2 has a characteristic called sleep spindles,
Okay.
which is kind of a burst of electrical activity that you see that's characteristic within that stage of sleep, and that a burst of activity seems to play an important role in, say, learning, right? It seems to play an important role in, like, kind of how kind of neurons talk to each other, kind of consolidation of different aspects of cognition. And so we know that has that particular role there. And then slow wave sleep, this N3, is relevant for, say, restoration. We think it might be kind of why people feel restored is when they get this. And then rapid eye movement sleep. I mean, this is when dreaming happens, but also seems to play an important role in things like emotional memory. And there are, there's still a lot to learn there, but certainly each aspect of sleep is important for our overall survival. Now we can kind of go without certain pieces of it, right? Like so there are some drugs that people can take, just prescription medications that may suppress REM activity, for instance, and people tend to do okay, but we still think that all of these pieces are relevant, and our body will help compensate for those things when they're missing. If we deprive someone of sleep, for instance, the first thing that happens when they're allowed to sleep is they kind of drop right into deep sleep.
Okay.
And the thought is that that's because it's such a important nourishing aspect to sleep that our body needs to kind of like grab up as fast as it can.
So it's like sleep serves all of these different functions, and it's like that can't all just happen in one type of like stage. Like it needs multiple different stages for that to happen.
I mean, I think it's like, we observe these stages and then we make that inference,
Okay.
right? Like, I don't know, but that this is what we have.
Mhm.
And it seems like if you kind of, you can do experiments where you try to kind of dismantle it, right? Where you'll just block a certain part of sleep and see what happens to someone, right? Like it, and so then we'll try to kind of figure that out, or you'll maybe do kind of animal studies and try to piece apart like what exactly happens when you don't have this thing and when you put it back in, like any kind of good experiment. But at the end of the day, I mean, we're still kind of chipping away at this science, and like I said, kind of discovering things on the regular.
So you also, I remember you mentioned the EEG, and then you also talked about how a new thing called, I think it was spectral analysis, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you think, like, do you know, I guess, of any studies going on right now that are trying to probe deeper into the brain during sleep or anything like that?
Yeah, so I mean, well, like in fact, so there's a way to actually measure sleep, deep in the brain,
Mhm.
right? There's a tool called deep brain stimulation,
I've heard of
which
that.
may or may have not heard of. So that's, it's only used in kind of extreme cases, right? Like if people perhaps have, um, you know, refractory epilepsy, right? Like that can't be, and they'll kind of insert something like into the brain itself. Um, and the same is true in Parkinson's. It's been shown to be effective. But they're starting to do it in the context of, say, people that have treatment resistant depression,
Mhm.
right? So people have depression where they're like cannot be effectively addressed with medicines or whatever else. They'll do this, but and so because you can insert it into the brain, it also can measure,
Mhm.
right? So there are groups, including people at UCSF, where they're kind of measuring the brain activity that's happening when this thing is in someone's like literal brain,
Mhm.
to get kind of a better, deeper, kind of perhaps more localized measure of that. And so, I mean, yeah, I mean, like as technology evolves, there'll be more opportunities to be able to kind of understand what's going on in the brain, not just when people are sleeping, but like when they're awake. I mean, there's like so much about the brain that is fascinating. I personally, I'm not a neuroscientist, but it definitely kind of blows my mind every time we have a new discovery in that domain.
Yeah, I think like recently I read about how apparently like the deep brain stimulation you mentioned, there's been like an FDA approved uh I guess sort of treatment. I don't want to say treatment because I don't think it's like curative or anything, but a treatment for ADHD with deep brain stimulation and like some neural input
Mm.
or something, which was it was pretty cool to read. It's like because ADHD for so long has been something that's like it's not curable or anything, but it's
Yeah.
like the advent of these technologies, we're kind of shifting towards a better approach to these diseases.
Yeah, it's like a neurotherapeutic.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Where are we? So yeah, so sleep has been connected to the process of synaptic pruning in the brain. And does
Yeah.
this mean that people who get more sleep typically have quicker neural development or greater like efficiency with their brain than those who don't?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't think we have a good understanding about neurodevelopment. I
Mm,
think this was a when I spoke at your school, like this actual question came up then too, and I was like, wow, I don't think that's known because it's actually really hard to study neurodevelopment. I mean, perhaps in animal models, and maybe I don't know. On the other part of your question, I mean, there is certainly good experimental data to suggest that various aspects of cognition are dampened or hurt when people don't get the sleep they need,
mhm,
like especially in acute settings. And there is, likewise, growing data to suggest that when people don't get sufficient amounts of sleep for a long period of time, that may lead to things like earlier onset of dementia or mild cognitive impairment. And so the flip side of that is that, like, when you do get the sleep you need, you would potentially, be protected, and kind of more efficient cognitively.
mhm,
And then there's kind of like really interesting studies where they, like around creativity and memory retrieval, in following sleep, even naps that seem to kind of improve people's ability to kind of have insight, in, say, a creative problem solving or just kind of remembering things that can be helpful. So it's always a good example or good evidence against kind of cramming all night versus getting a good night's sleep.
yeah. So the synaptic pruning that I mentioned, so is that something that is aided by sleep? And if so, like how does that help? Like how does that improve brain function?
Well, so I mean, my understanding is that that sleep does play a role in
Mhm,
synaptic pruning. And the pruning helps kind of create the neural paths that are more efficient, right? So it can kind of lay the tracks. Kind of if you think about, if you ever drive in the snow, right? Like the tires make these paths, and so like future cars can like go down that path, right? And
yeah.
that's partly what like synaptic pruning will end up doing, is like creating a more efficient path. And so to the extent that sleep plays a role in it, probably the more efficient that path is.
Yeah. All right. So Sigmund Freud, you've probably heard of him. So
Heard of
he,
them.
yeah, him and his like psychoanalysis, right? He's all about talking about how the latent content, or like I guess like the overall content of our dreams, it represents our unconscious desires and motivations. So does modern research agree with Freud in this scenario? Because I do know from my school classes that modern research does contradict a lot of his other theories. And if not, what do any current theories have to say about why we dream and what we dream of?
Yeah, I mean, dreams are fascinating, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Like, I mean, right, like it's amazing. It's amazing. I like there is no strong evidence to support that dreams reflect some kind of deep-seated anything.
Mhm.
Um, but that being said, it is interesting that like people have some of the same types of dreams, right? And so, it's easy to fall into that idea that like, wow, like maybe there is something like in our humanness, right? Like
Yeah.
that helps explain that. Currently, modern science hasn't been able to kind of verify that. I mean,
Mhm.
it's certainly the case that we often dream about things that go on in our life, right? And there may be, there are theories about the importance of things like REM sleep in, like I mentioned, kind of emotional memory, and in particular, uh, this idea that one of the things that REM sleep might do is kind of detach kind of the emotional experience from a memory from the fact of that memory,
Okay.
right? So with the idea that like if you were to kind of remember something that happened in the past that was perhaps traumatic, you wouldn't feel all of the emotions and things that are related to that memory, which is
Mhm.
adaptive, right? You want to learn, but you don't want to kind of like suffer
Yeah.
in that way. And so one of the kind of pieces of potential evidence to support that is people that have post-traumatic stress disorder. So post-traumatic stress disorder is, a condition that is brought on by some kind of traumatic event. And one of the things that some of the things that happen is people have nightmares, people have flashbacks. So
Mhm.
this kind of re-experiencing this thing that happened in the past with all of the physiologic and emotional stuff that goes along with it. And the other thing that they tend to have is something called REM fragmentation. So
Okay.
their REM sleep is like not as kind of consolidated or predictable. And
Mhm.
it's thought that like maybe because that's happening, like that's one of the things that a consequence, and that's how it's related to emotional memory. And so, I mean, like dreams are not well understood, but in general, they they tend to be kind of a phenomenon that occurs, usually related to kind of people's experience in their daily lives or things that they're thinking about and kind of that are kind of like perhaps high arousal things that they're experiencing, um, but beyond that, they're just kind of things that we like to talk about.
Mhm. So do you think that dreams are something that the community is trying to work on to like figure out why they happen, or is that not really an area of like interest, I guess?
There's absolutely people that are like dream researchers,
Hmm.
right? Like there's like um I feel like so there's like a great Netflix series. I think it's called like Mind Explained.
Okay.
And there's an episode about dreaming,
Hmm.
and the guy that they interview for the whole thing is this guy at Harvard, and he is like a phenomenal dream researcher. And so, like it's a great, there are definitely groups that do this around in the kind of the sleep medicine, and certainly in Europe too, where a lot of this work goes on. And but I mean, it's still probably not it's not kind of the bread and butter of what people do
Yeah.
from a research perspective, I think.
Okay. Um, so what is the science behind this is something that I was actually really interested in learning about. But what is the science behind certain sleep phenomena such as snoring, like sleepwalking, sleep talking, and why do these happen in only like some people and not others?
Yeah, these are great questions. And, we don't have great answers for these. Snoring is happens in most people and it changes with age.
Mhm.
And it's something that is kind of a pipes problem, right? Like so like air, getting through your nose, kind
Mhm.
of the soft palate of your throat can create vibrations and create sounds. And at an extreme, like people will begin to experience obstructions while they're sleeping,
Mhm.
that will cause them to wake up. Kind of anybody who's been around that like is like a loud snore, they might like kind of like, and that's like your airway kind of trying to open up so you can breathe. And
Yeah.
so that's called obstructive sleep apnea. And it's a pretty serious condition, but can be, yeah, addressed. These other ones, these other parasomnias, like, sleep talking, sleepwalking, they tend to happen. Um, it's not quite understood like why it happens for people. Sleepwalking is an interesting one because like people tend to grow out of it. Like it happens more often when people are kids, maybe when they're teens, but less so when they're adults. There's like all of these kind of really interesting ones. I was um, yeah, there's just so many interesting like sleep related things. I was reading about this thing yesterday, which I didn't know about, which is this kind of like really rare sleep condition, where people, when they about to fall asleep, they like hear kind of like wind, and
Okay.
it like is so disturbing, and they just like can't sleep as a consequence.
That's odd.
And or like I was meeting with someone, and it sounds like they might have exploding head syndrome, uh, which
Floating.
is like the sound, which is like when they're tend to people go to sleep, they'll like hear this like big bang,
Okay.
and it'll like they'll wake up. I don't know if you've ever like it's kind of a much more severe type of thing than like a hypnic jerk, where like if you're like about to fall asleep, you might like your arm might move, or like you'll
Yeah.
jerk your head. Like that's really common, but like there are these things that happen in the brain that we don't quite know exactly the origin, but can impact people's ability to sleep or stay asleep or create distress that makes it hard for them to want to go to sleep, all these kind of things. And
Mhm.
there's it's totally kind of worth kind of looking into. I think the other one that is, interesting is one called REM behavior disorder. And
Okay.
so this is this experience where when you're in REM sleep, most people have muscle atonia, means that like you basically lose muscle tone so that you don't act out your dreams,
Oh yeah.
right? But there's people that have REM behavior disorder where they don't have that, and they like will flail in the night, they'll get up, they'll and you often hear about them like punching their partner in the middle of the night, things like that. And it's a pretty challenging condition.
Mhm.
And but it's just another one of those where we're kind of understanding some of the underlying neurobiology, but still because they're sort of rare, it's like harder to study, but certainly for people who are listening who want to get into sleep science, lots of things to figure out there.
Yeah. So you mentioned the hypnic jerk. So real quick, is that like when I don't know, I think something that's pretty common amongst a lot of people is that sometimes when you're sleeping, you'll feel like you're falling off of a cliff or something, like a falling type of sensation. So is that the same thing? Or
No, hypnic jerks are like when you're, I always think about when I was in high school, like
Mhm.
I would, if you like put your head down on your desk and all of a sudden like your arm would like fly off
Oh
or
yeah.
something like that. Like that's more what that is. Like it's kind of this like, this kind of, I don't know what you call it, but yeah, no, I know that feeling that you're talking about. I actually don't know what causes that, but these kind of shared experiences. Yep.
Yeah. All right. So this is also a pretty interesting segment that I was looking
Okay.
forward to. So this is the
Yeah.
true or false, the true or false
Right.
with popular beliefs about sleep. So the first one I have is the idea that death feels like falling asleep. So what do you have to say about that?
I feel like we'll all know someday, but nobody can answer that question now.
Okay.
So I'm
Um,
gonna guess false.
false. Okay. And then sleeping in on weekends can make up for losing sleep during the week.
That's true and false. You can definitely sleep in during the weekend, which can provide some like level of like restoration. But I think that, I wouldn't be a good sleep medicine person if I didn't say that there's a cost, like there's ultimately a cost of like not getting enough sleep during the week that you can't make up during the weekend. So for instance, if we deprive someone of a full night of sleep, when we let them go to sleep the next night, it's not like they'll sleep 16 hours, right? Like 8 hours and 8 hours. They'll
Yeah.
like sleep like 10 hours or 12 hours. And so there's likely something about that missing hours because sleep does things that that things that only happen when we sleep. And so there's really no way to kind of recoup that.
Yeah. So does that have anything to do with kind of like breaking or altering your circadian rhythm? Like, does that have an effect on, like, I guess the effectiveness of your sleep?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, which part? Like sleeping in on weekends?
Yeah, just having like I guess sort of like an inconsistent sleep schedule.
Yeah, so I mean that's what we worry about. So kind of how variable someone's sleep is that it seems to your circadian rhythm is just we're learning more and more about how important it is for our health.
Hmm.
These systems kind of work much better when they're more finely tuned and regulated and predictable. And so when people kind of shift their schedules kind of dramatically one way or the other, like on a regular basis, it seems to throw things off. And there's kind of now more large scale, like population level data of thousands and thousands of people that when people seem to do that, they're at the same kind of risks as people who don't get enough sleep,
Mm.
even if they get enough sleep for like heart disease and diabetes and a whole bunch of things. And so it's becoming increasingly important. The more predictable you can keep your schedule, the better. I mean, this is where like shift workers we see it being a really tough for them because they do have to live in these kind of these shifted timelines.
Yeah. So I guess sort of like under that same umbrella, does the time, like, say you're getting 8 hours of sleep, right? Does it matter when those 8 hours of sleep come? Like, I get my mom always says to me like, you should always try to sleep from like 10 to 6, and then that's not going to be the same as sleeping from like 12 to 8. So how like to what extent is that true?
I mean, like there is something about the amount that is important regardless of when you get it.
Hmm.
Um, that, but there is this circadian rhythm that it plays an important role. So like our sleep works best when it's in line with kind of what our natural rhythm is, and then we sleep at that time, like when that's happening. I think the idea that there's like a set time on the clock that matters is more like a cultural thing that like we think that that's true, and we think that the early bird gets the worm, and like we think that all these I mean these are things that are based in some level of truth but are not, like the science isn't really there to kind of make it so conclusive that way.
Okay. So does like the I guess the sunrise, sunset, like does that have anything to kind of do with why we believe these things? Like you should
Well, I mean, like that definitely matters for kind of in training our circadian rhythm. I mean, as humans,
Mhm.
like sunlight is kind of the strongest factor for entraining our rhythm.
Mhm.
And so there is something to that. But like obviously, if you went to sleep right when the sun went down, the sun is down more than 8 hours. So it's like it's not possible. In fact, this is where, this idea of like where there might have been a time where people kind of had two sleeps. They would like sleep for a chunk when the sun went down, they'd be up for a couple hours and they'd sleep again. And the thinking is that like when we got indoor lighting, that kind of changed that. The Industrial Revolution changed that, and there's people that contend that we should go back to that, although just the world isn't set up for that kind of thing. I mean, thinking you go to bed at 6 is not going to work. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So the third one, alcohol and sleeping pills can be used to facilitate sleepiness.
uh, those can definitely facilitate sleepiness.
Okay.
True.
But
You probably don't want to. There's other ways, but like that's those both of those things are psychoactive agents that can induce sleepiness. Yes.
but do you think using those are a good idea? Or can they
No. But that wasn't the question. But yeah,
yeah.
yeah. No. I mean, alcohol definitely can disrupt your sleep. So it can help people fall asleep, but it ends up fragmenting your sleep. Sleeping pills, are unfortunately kind of pretty psychologically addicting. People tend to kind of feel like they can't sleep without them, right? So you're kind of like hooked on them in that way, just because you're so worried about not having them. And so, as someone who helps people get off of these sorts of things, there are good behavioral strategies to get people sleeping better without those agents.
Can you go into more depth about the kind of work you do with that, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, so in our clinic, I mean, people have been dealing with sleep problems for a long time, and so a lot of them are understandably taking sleep medication, but they come to us because either they want to be off the medication or the medication isn't working that great,
Hmm.
like because sleep medication kind of masks the symptoms,
Hmm.
like it doesn't treat the problem. And there's kind of growing evidence that there may be considerations for brain health over the long term and taking kind of some of these medications day in and day out or each night. And so we use cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, which is like a bunch of like a suite of behavioral techniques
Hmm.
to improve and consolidate someone's sleep. And at the same time, as we're doing that, we're kind of like slowly tapering the medication. So kind of day by day or week by week, kind of decreasing the amount of doses, someone kind of gains more confidence in their ability to sleep without them. And then over time, we stop. And it's a pretty um, kind of gentle and successful strategy for getting people off of these medications.
Hmm. Okay. So the fourth one, listening to music can be a good way of entering a relaxed and sleepy state.
True. Well, it depends on the music, I guess, but yeah, no, that is totally a strategy that I suggest for people, right?
Mhm.
I mean, it can be relaxing. and kind of help people kind of let go and start to feel those sleepy cues and kind of transition into bedtime. I mean, lots of people have lots of things that work for them. I always say that like sleep is universal, but it's also really personal. And so
Mhm.
there are things that will work for you that maybe don't work for others. And so maybe it takes some experimentation, but listening to music, listening to like podcasts, listening to things that you don't have to, that you can listen to and learn from, but not necessarily get really worked up about is a great strategy for kind of getting yourself relaxed.
Okay. Using a phone before bed or sleeping near a phone can have negative effects.
Sleeping, you know, if you use the phone, it can have negative effects, right? I mean, I don't worry about the Wi-Fi or the cellular signal affecting your brain or something like that, but I mean, right, like their phones are kind of call to us, especially at bedtime or first thing in the morning or in the middle of the night, and if you're someone where it's um, alluring and you need to scroll, you need to kind of like get into whatever
Mhm.
doom scrolling type of situation, that's gonna definitely kind of impact your ability to sleep. The content on phones uh, is incredibly rewarding to your brain, and it wants another hit, and that is not compatible with sleeping.
I've seen some things about, I don't know, like if you sleep near a phone, the electromagnetic radiation from it or something can affect the way you sleep. So is that like to what extent do you think that's true?
I don't know if that's true.
Mm.
Sounds not true, but I'm sure there's like a whole part of the internet that will say that that's true. So, but I don't know.
Yeah. Um, so then posture matters when you sleep.
Posture, well, like, I deal in the business of trying to get people to sleep well. And, some people sleep better on their side, some people sleep better on their stomach. I mean, I think the only place where there can be problems is when people sleep on their back, especially if they are a little bit heavier and it impacts their breathing. And so, usually when we have people do sleep studies where they come into the lab or they do one at home where we measure their sleep and their breathing, the way they break down uh, the number of apneas or hypopneas that people have is like whether it is like if they're sleeping on their back or supine or non-supine. And so like it's like that important, that posture is that important that they, it's like identified in the recording
Mhm.
because they happen more often that way, and it's treatable. But I think people have preferences in how they sleep, and it's about kind of getting comfortable for you. I don't think there's like a necessarily like a strong science base on like one being better than the other, although there's lots of things on the internet about that.
And then the last one, the body can adapt to sleep deprivation.
Oh, the body. So I mean, humans have an amazing capacity for discomfort
Mhm.
and for perseverance, right? I mean, people can adapt to sleep deprivation in that it becomes habitual. You see this in certain professions. You see this in, like the military, firefighters, policemen, doctors, nurses, people that have, shift schedules that experience sleep deprivation. They'll do it for years and years and years and years. Um, that is an adaptation, but there is, we do know that there's a potential cost to that, right? And oftentimes, some of the things that people um, they begin to not notice the problems that they're having. So that like I went to a lecture last Friday where the presenter showed sleep deprivation over time, like kind of like when people kind of went multiple nights of sleep deprivation,
Okay.
and and then on like so that's the x-axis, like number of days of sleep deprivation. It was like instead of not full nights, but like their sleep was reduced by 4 hours. So instead of getting 8 hours, they only got 4 hours.
Mhm.
And they did that for a number of different nights. And then on the y-axis, they had kind of the score of there were two graphs. One that was like someone's subjective subjective sleepiness over time. And as the days went on, they started to like it kind of plateaued. Like people felt really bad the first couple days, but then they just kind of just were like, I just feel bad, but like the next days didn't seem to produce any more badness for them, right? Like it was like they kind of like adapted to it. They were just like, this is my life now. But they also did objective measures of, in this case, lapses. So there's like an objective test called the psychomotor vigilance test, where you basically are doing this kind of game type thing, and it tracks reaction time and like mistakes and all this kind of stuff. And that with every subsequent day, it got worse and worse and worse and worse. And so what happened was like there was this disconnect between people's subjective experience of sleepiness and like feeling like garbage and their objective one. Like they just began to not see the mistakes they were making, right? And this is what happens. So people can adapt to sleep deprivation, but they often are blind to the decrements that it has both on their body and on their mind.
Yeah. So it's just like, so one of the graphs, the subjective one, that one plateaued, right? But then the other one just kept rising. So it's like,
Yeah.
I guess you sort of think that it's not having an effect, but it definitely does.
Yes.
It's pretty cool. So you published a book in 2022 called The Sleep Prescription. So what do you think are the most important points to take away from that book, and why do you think it's important for people to read it?
I mean, so like that book, which I was like so lucky to be able to do, was the goal was to kind of distill the principles of cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia to like the general public. Because I think that like the principles that are in that program are probably beneficial to most people that have sleep problems. They don't have to necessarily have like clinically diagnosed insomnia, though many people do, and they're seeking help. And so I think that there are kind of two things that I tell everyone. Like if you're going to try and get your sleep back on track today, like these are the things that you want to do. Like the first is to stabilize your wake up time. So or your circadian rhythm plays a real big role. And so you want to kind of try to get up at the same time each day, every day, as a way of kind of setting kind of in line kind of your rhythm and kind of the other regulators of your sleep. Like it's an anchor point that you can control. When people have sleep problems, it can be really stressful when we're like, well, you have to be in bed you have to go to sleep at 10 or 10:30 or 11 or whatever. Because, as it gets closer to that, people will begin to be like, oh, dang, like I'm not feeling sleepy. Like now I'm worried about it. Why I'm not going to sleep. Oh my God. Like now what's going to happen? And then they can't sleep, but you can control when you wake up. And so we focus on that. The other thing is, you don't want to spend a lot of time in bed not sleeping. So the bed itself is actually a really important trigger for sleep. So it's kind of basic classical conditioning. So like when you're sleepy a lot of time in bed, the bed itself actually makes you sleepy.
Yeah.
Right. And when you spend a lot of time awake, nervous, anxious, angsty, tossing and turning in bed, the bed will become a trigger for those things. And that's what happens with insomnia. Like people begin to they say things to me all the time, like where they're like, I was feeling really sleepy and then I got in bed and my brain woke up. And that's that conditioned response. Like that is because you just had like a terrible run of like bad nights and now you're kind of like it's all kind of fractured. And so we say like don't get in bed until you're sleepy, right? So you want to feel those sleepy cues before you get in bed. And then if you wake up in the middle of the night and you're like awake for, longer than you feel like it should, like we say like 20 minutes and you can't get back to sleep, maybe you want to kind of get out of bed and kind of do something quiet, maybe listen to some relaxing music, maybe, don't pick up your phone ideally and like start engaging whatever your brain wants to engage in, but something that's relaxing for you until you feel sleepy again, then you want to get it back in bed. And that will help rebuild this relationship. And so, I mean, I think if people can start doing those two things, they can kind of get back. I mean, in addition to like, typical sleep hygiene things like don't drink a monster drink right before bed, or like, keep the room dark and quiet and cool and those sorts of things. These are these other things that people don't think about. And so, I mean, like there's lots of books out there. I think, the thing that's unique about this particular book is it frames things in that like you know, most people, when they think about how they're going to improve their sleep, they're thinking about like the hour, the 30 minutes, the 15 minutes before they get in bed.
Hmm.
But like I try to make the case that like it starts like the moment you wake up, there's opportunities to kind of put yourself in the best position to have a good night's sleep. And it also, like, I think one of the things about the book is I think the tone of it is compassionate and like, look, we're all trying to do our best. Like, I mean, but it's hard. But I think, you know, the more you can kind of chip away at it and put these parameters in place, you know, you're going to increase the odds that you have a better night's sleep. And
Hmm.
not every night's going to be great, and that's okay. But you can kind of work at it, and there's always room for improvement.
Hmm. Yeah, that's great. You mentioned we like the wake up time is something that we can control, and that's a good way to start fixing your sleep schedule. But by like fixing a wake up time, do you think like compromising on the, I guess, the hours spent to sleep is okay for that? Like say one day maybe you have to go to sleep later because you have a lot of work or something, and would it still be advisable to like stick to that wake up time, or should that be pushed back in those cases?
So I mean, I guess I would make the distinction between like, you know, sleep for kind of sleep because you have like limited opportunity
Hmm.
versus sleep problems because you can't fall asleep or stay asleep.
Okay.
Right? Like, so if you're trying to work on your sleep because you're having trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, these are the things that you want to do. Now, like, right, like life happens and, you know, you have to make these trade-offs, right? And if you have to stay up to get something done and you have the opportunity to sleep in a little bit more, like that probably makes sense.
Hmm.
But, you know, if you also have this problem of not being able to stay asleep or get to sleep like that, you know, you have to kind of weigh those things. I think there is a really big importance in kind of getting the sleep you need. And you have to make those compromises. But I mean, if you're trying to improve the continuity and kind of consistency and restorative nature of your sleep, these are the types of things that you should do. But right, like you have to figure it out. And I mean, I in this book, and then like in our, I mean, like everything that I talk about in that book is the same thing that I do in like my clinic. But you know, sometimes it turns out that oftentimes people, they think they have a sleep problem, a nighttime problem, but they
Hmm.
really have like a daytime problem.
Hmm.
That like their life is such that it is impairing their ability to get the sleep they need, right? They have so many demands,
Hmm.
they have so many obligations, and the stress that comes with it, that is the problem. And if they didn't have those things, they'd be able to sleep fine.
Hmm.
And so it's about like, okay, well, you know, we need to kind of figure this out. Like you know, it could be that you need to kind of address this thing that is making you so you have to stay up late every night, right? And like hopefully it's not a demand. Maybe it's like, well, I want to, you know, I have this meetup at night with my friends and like this, you know, like I don't know, like whatever, Gamescape or something, and like you're just staying on. But you know, like those things are things that are addressable potentially if you make sleep a priority. Like, but you know, like you also want to kind of like live your life and all those kind of things. So it's kind of trying to figure out what works best for you. But we do know from the science that like sleep is critical, and it kind of makes people the best version of themselves.
Hmm. Yeah. So we talked about like the, I guess, the barriers that a lot of people face to sleeping. And one of those that we talked about when you came to my school. But one of those is like with students like us, like high schoolers, it's like we have a lot of work and it's difficult to balance that with like a healthy sleep schedule. So do you see any realistic solutions to this issue? Like I know one of them that we discussed was like pushing back school start times, but wouldn't that just make kids fall asleep later? Like if they're coming back from school later. So
Yeah, it's a really kind of multi-layered problem. I mean, I think school start times is like a great step. Um, I think the challenge is that you have to do it on both ends. That like, you know, you can change that part to give people more opportunity, but then we have to ensure by various means that like adolescents use that opportunity to get more sleep,
Mhm.
right? Versus like just then going to bed later, like pushing
Yeah.
everything, right? And I mean, so, going to your school and talking to other folks, I mean, I guess some people can make the case that we're like, well, it's because I'm like doing homework all the way up until bedtime, but like I don't think that's true for most,
Yeah.
like I think there's like gotta be some level of like compromise in the discussion that like it's not just that. And so maybe in that extra time, like we kind of figure out a way to do that, and make sure that people are getting the sleep they need, because we know that it's so important for kind of development and growth and kind of all those good things, and that there's like risks in people not getting sleep. I mean, I think motor vehicle accidents is like a great example of where we see that insufficient sleep can play a big role, and you never want to see those things happen. So um I do think that there is some hope, like at least on the policy side for the school start times, but then it's kind of trying to figure out how to make sure that adolescents like yourself like make use of that time
Mhm.
for sleeping.
Yeah. And I can definitely attest to what you said earlier. Like, not all that time is used to do homework. There's definitely
Yeah.
somewhere there. But yeah,
Yeah.
that's all I had for today. It was great talking to you. It was really insightful. Um, so I think that's the end of this episode, unless you have anything more to add.
No, no, it was great. Thanks for having me on. A great
Mhm.
show, and I hope everyone sleeps well out there.
For sure. All right, I'll talk to you later, Dr.
All
Prather.
right. Thanks a lot.
Mhm.